thank you all for coming today. Thank you all for staying. Just on a quick personal note, I love the Palm Springs Festival. Yeah. It's great. I love this film, and I love these people. I think you will too. I feel like we would be lucky to have any one of them. The fact that we've got all three, I'm telling you, this is your lucky day. So we'll bring on the director of the film. He started out in documentaries, including the Oscar-winning Man on Wire. I know. James Marsh. In the role of Jane, last year she was in The Invisible Woman, the Ralph Fiennes movie. She's a wonderful actress and a really good person. Felicity Jones. Stephen Hawking, you may remember him from films like Les Miserables. He's a terrific actor. Eddie Redmayne. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Marshall, just give a little background.
James.
Well, you deserve a lot of respect, I'm telling you. I think the project started with the writer, Anthony McCartan. Yeah.
It did. I think he spent quite a lot of time having encountered Jane's memoir and convincing her across several years to agree to the film to go ahead. And meanwhile, he was working on the script throughout that time. So when I got to the project, that had been put in place. Jane had agreed for the film to go ahead, and the script was in a pretty good condition. So I joined it with a script that was promising, and then we worked on it together with the actors, which felt like an important collaboration going into this project, given that the actors had such a burden in this particular film. They do in every film, but this one felt a bit more kind of challenging. So we all worked together on the script, and that carried on actually throughout the filming process too.
Yeah, but, I mean, I do want to talk about that burden later. But also, I think you had actually met with Jane Hawking. Yeah.
Yes. Hello, everyone. It was actually quite late on that both Eddie and I went to meet Stephen and Jane. It was quite late on in our preparation process. We had many months, thanks to James, to really understand who these people were, and we're watching archive about them and reading up about them as much as possible. And so it's quite daunting when we went to actually meet them, because you've done all this research and you just hope that you've been, working in the right direction. And then, so I went to meet Jane in her house. She lives in Cambridge, on the outskirts of Cambridge, with her husband, Jonathan Hellier Jones. And actually, when I met her, it just made playing her, I had so many ideas, just the way, as soon as she answered the door, the way she moved, there was this dance-like quality to her, and she has such vivacity and an openness, and as I was talking, I was talking to her, we were having a coffee and chatting and just getting to know her. I was sort of felt a little bit disingenuous, because then I was just observing everything she was doing, the way she picks up her mug, or the way her foot moves, or, yes, and just kind of cataloguing everything about her. And it's that thing of it's a meeting, and you don't want an impersonation, but you want to inhabit that person's essence. And it was a fantastic meeting.
Well, there's a line of Brian, the schoolmate of Stephen Hawking, at one point picks him up to carry him up the stairs and says, "God, I don't know how Jane manages." Did she talk about that at all? I mean, I think it's in the book. But...
Well, that's what I found with her. It was this profound emotional strength that she had, and commitment and devotion. But then, as you say, this twinned physical strength at the same time. And I actually, I realised I had to start going to the gym. I hate going to the gym. Sort of work out, to get strong enough for the heavy lifting that is involved with, and then speaking to carers and realising, it's a difficult situation to be in, both emotionally and physically. Absolutely.
And I think you worked with people. I keep wanting to call it ALS, but it's not called ALS in Britain.
It's a confusing illness, because ALS is a motor neuron disease, and we call it MND, motor neuron disease, in the UK. But yeah, so from just after when James cast me, both Felicity and I, we started going to a clinic in London called the Queen Square Neurology Clinic, and it felt like that was a good place to start, was to really educate ourselves on what the illness was. And there was a specialist there who has a clinic every week, and we would go to the clinic, and she would meet the people suffering at various different stages, and at the end she would say, "Look, there are these actors here who are portraying Jane and Stephen Hawking. Would you be interested in meeting them?" And across the board they were so generous to us, and a few of them allowed us into their homes, invited us into their homes, and this one gentleman, Glenn, he would allow you to sort of feel his fingers, or feel what the difference between upper neurons and lower neurons are, for example, which are sort of the complexity of the illness, and that generosity of spirit, but also not just the physical ramifications, but their sort of humour. There was one guy I met who, the day that I met him, he had just the night before almost choked to death, and it had been really severe. And he had walked down the following morning, and he'd turned to his wife, and the first thing he had said is, "I wonder what death-defying act I can do this morning." And that sense of finding humour in extraordinarily complicated circumstances was important for us.
Yeah. Now, have those people seen the film?
Many of them came to the premiere in London. In fact, there was a very sad story that Glenn, the gentleman I was talking about specifically, he lives in Watford, and he was coming to the premiere, and I was on the red carpet with Stephen, and this gentleman arrived who looked identical to Glenn. It was Glenn's brother, and he had told us that the taxi company hadn't turned up, and so Glenn was there waiting to come and see the film, and hadn't made it to the premiere, but they're having a screening for him, I think, this week. But there were so many people who gave us so much, and yeah, many of them came to the premiere in London.
Yeah. Well, no, I want to talk about a couple of scenes, because I think you rehearsed before you started filming. Yeah.
We did a couple of weeks, not my normal way of doing things, but in this case we felt we needed to understand a lot about what Eddie was going to do and Felicity was going to do with him to interact. It's a kind of dance they do throughout the story. So we did rehearse, and the DP became part of that rehearsal process too. And I think it was very productive. We found out things. Again, we were pushing at the script still at that point. So the rehearsals allowed us to develop the script a bit more, understand the physicality, and understand how to film that, to shoot it in a particular way that was part of, obviously, the film.
And was it basically the three of you plus the DP?
Yes, he would come and go, and we brought in other actors also towards the end of that process to interact with what we were doing, and that was very, very useful and necessary, I think, on this one.
Also, there was a sense, I think, for more than I've ever experienced on a film with this, that every department, the work of every department affected the work of every other department. So whatever Felicity and I were doing physically, if that was costumed incorrectly, then it wouldn't expose what was happening, and that would affect the makeup. I remember James had several tests, actual camera tests early on, to see which angles were most successful to shoot from, and what sort of, and so there was this amazing sense that every department had to be as open as possible, because we really needed to work in a collaborative way, with James being the sort of conductor of it all.
Now, did you concentrate on any scenes that were in the script that were like particularly naughty. I mean, I saw the film again the other night, and there's the dinner scene with the peas and potatoes and Einstein, and there's a lot going on in that scene. And I'm thinking, were there some scenes that were like more complex than others?
Oh, definitely, that was one of them. Any eating seems difficult because just the nature of what you're doing. You spend a day eating, basically. Oh, and Stephen's case, not eating. So that, it's always a bit, but this was even more complicated. It was such a layered scene. It was a turning point in the story. An able-bodied man comes into this home. The mere act of him picking up his fork means something in that environment. The fact that he's able-bodied around Jane means something. The fact that he tries to help Stephen, and there's one of my favourite moments in the film when Stephen scowls at that. That was a very interesting scene to shoot. It took us a day to shoot that. I think the scene where Stephen and Jane go their separate ways is also a very complicated scene to shoot because of the emotional complexity of that, when someone can't communicate, when someone can't comfort physically the other person. And that scene was quite difficult, I think. My recollection, that was a very intense and quite difficult day. So clearly it's a kind of film where certain scenes were more complicated than others and needed time and experimentation too. I wanted to make an atmosphere on set where we could try things and maybe fail sometimes, but it felt we should be free to really express this story as well as we could, with the ability to fail as well as to succeed.
Yeah, it's always, there's always those certain scenes in a screenplay that you're slightly dreading. You know that they're coming up, and you sort of go and you read it and you have a few thoughts, but they almost feel quite. You don't want to mess with them too much in a way. And that scene when Stephen and Jane do part, I remember we didn't actually over-rehearse that scene. That was one where I think we were careful that we wanted to keep that emotional vulnerability to it. And it was just great to have the time, the whole day to shoot that. I remember a lot of the rehearsal actually was spent on the early, it's almost like I was thinking of it as the first act of the screenplay when they first meet. And that's what we spent a lot of time in rehearsal, just trying to get that youthful naivety and spontaneity and passion into those first scenes when they're falling in love. So we tried loads of different things out and had loads of time to, as James said, to experiment, which is so nice as an actor.
Yeah. Talking about those early scenes, I mean, the May Ball sequence is very, I think, the most elaborate thing. So one would think those must be really difficult to do, but maybe not.
Well, it was difficult. It was an idea that came quite late in the scripting of the film, so we had to then quite quickly understand how to do that. And you start with basically a dark field. And day 2 of our production, there was 2 night shoots. And I think it was very useful to have something so difficult early on. It made us all really focus, and we couldn't have a gentle start to this production. We were straight in with what became, essentially that scene allows Felicity and Eddie to kind of connect with each other as Jane and Stephen fall in love across that May Ball scene. So if that didn't work, then nothing was going to work in the film. And so it was quite complicated. The writing of that whole scene was very difficult and complicated. But that was when I began to feel confident, when I saw the connection between the 2 actors in those 2 nights of work, and how I really believed in them and believed in this love story at that point. And it was again, we didn't rehearse that too much, but I remember walking around a lot the days beforehand, nervously walking around this dark field trying to understand what we were going to do with that. And then we improvised a lot of that scene too. It was, again, a scene which needed a certain kind of spontaneity, which, again, Eddie and Felicity had rehearsed and understood the characters so well that then when you come to actually do it, there was spontaneity there. And I think that's why it worked so well. It was such a rich scene.
There was also a fortunate coincidence on that day when James talks about our connection, is that was also the day that Jane, Jonathan and Stephen came to visit on set. And so it was that May Ball, and I will never forget it. We had 3 sets of fireworks, so we had 3 takes at the big firework display, so everyone was a bit nervous that we needed to get those in those 3 takes. And on cue, Stephen arrived, his famous silhouette, flanked by his nurses, spotlit by his computer screen, and the first set of fireworks went off. And it was like the greatest rock star entrance you have ever seen in your life. But for all of those scenes, Felicity and I, there was literally out of one eye line were Jane and Jonathan, who had been so wonderful and generous to us, and out of the other eye line was Stephen and his carers, who had also been incredibly generous. And nothing forms a bond between two actors than going, we are terrified. So perhaps quite fortunate that's when they choose to go.
Yeah, it was definitely going in at the deep end. Absolutely.
Well, again, you talked about the burden, because I mean, you're not only trying to represent fairly people with ALS, but their caregivers and specific people, Jane, Stephen, and Jonathan, and just do the script. I mean, did you ever feel like overwhelmed? It's like, oh my God, what am I doing here?
Well, it does feel like a responsibility, and more so because we fell in love with these characters. I mean, they're not characters; they're real people. But they're such intricate, fascinating human beings, and have had such an extraordinary life, and there was so much richness in that's what felt like the burden. Every day we'd be saying, have we got that side of Jane, or that nuance of Stephen, to get the combination of their humour, and they're so unsentimental about their situation, even in the depths of difficulty they would find the lightness in it, and that's what felt, every day after work. It wasn't like you just finish and go and have a drink and not think about it. You would be, it would be percolating in your mind, and you'd be worried about it. So, and that definitely comes from playing real people.
Well, you've talked about the emotions on the film, but this looks like it was really hard on your body. I mean, if I'm sitting in an airplane seat for 2 hours, my body freaks out. But I mean, was it difficult?
It was. When I was cast, we had 4 months before we started filming, and one of the great gifts that James gave us was that time. And what I find interesting about making films is there is no method, there is no technique, there is no one way of approaching it. And the way that both Felicity and I approached it was to kind of almost go back to an old school way of working, in which you surround yourself by a team. And my instinct was, because I knew, even though James did try to see if we could shoot chronologically, it became apparent budget-wise that wasn't going to be possible. So we knew that we were both going to be playing Jane and Stephen at different stages in their lives, all within the same day. And so what we needed to work out was not only my physicality, but also Jane's relationship to that, because as James said, it is like a dance, that we really had that dance embedded at all the different stages in their lives, so that when it came to actually playing the emotions of the scenes, we didn't have to think about the physicality. So I ended up working with a dancer, a woman called Alex Reynolds, and for those 4 months we went to the clinic, and I learnt about ALS, and I found how to put that physicality in my body, and that involved going to an osteopath as well, who sort of started mapping my body through the rehearsal process and basically training your body to be able to sustain those positions for long periods of time. And it worked. I think, but in the sense that I didn't end up in a huge amount of pain. The vicious irony is I got on a plane to fly here, and I managed to crick my neck, and I can't really move in this direction today. So after a long break of a festive season, I'm now completely unable to move.
On day one of our production, Eddie had to be able-bodied, 1 stick, and then 2 sticks in a wheelchair on day 1. So he had to cross the whole tunnel of the film on the very first day of filming, and that was the pattern from the get-go. So if this work hadn't been done, if it wasn't so internalized, nothing would have worked in the film, and day 1 could have been an absolute disaster, and we could have been on a road to hell, basically. So that just shows, I think, the nature of the preparation that had to be done, given what we were doing, and that's I think, a tribute to the work that was done beforehand, that was possible on the very first day.
Wow.
No, what was the Magna Carta?
I have on my iPad still, the Magna Carta is a handwritten breakdown, beautifully written in Eddie's sort of very educated handwriting. Each scene was annotated with physicality, so I would know, and more importantly, Eddie would know what we could do and what we couldn't do, plus he also could see that and understand on each scene what we were working with. And it was a sort of key sacred text for our production, this very detailed breakdown of physicality scene by scene.
What was interesting about that process is when we were working on the script at the beginning with Anthony, is normally on film you want to have a certain freedom, and the director then goes into the edit and shifts this scene around and moves that one to this one. But the thing with ALS is that when a muscle stops working is it doesn't start again, and that absolute rigor to be authentic to what the disease was, given we had met so many people and their families who were suffering from it, was really important. And so much more so, I think, than in any other film, certainly I've ever worked on, we had to be intricate with the specifics. So this piece of paper basically just said what muscles stopped working when, and which, for example, which wheelchair he was in, so that, again, Fliss could know how we were interacting, and it, but also James allowed us to watch the rushes, the dailies, which never as an actor do you normally get, but because we needed to trace the intricacies of that, it was a very intimate sort of relationship.
And then Jane's physicality is not quite as pronounced, because what does the film span? Is it 25 years?
Yes, yeah.
So do you write notes in the script? Do you how do you keep track?
Well, I always feel like with a character, you want to have the emotional arc and shifts and changes, but then also the physical journey of that person, and obviously they were, I mean, completely different demands, but I guess a lot of it was how someone's body shifts and changes and ages over 25 years, and trying to do that in a way to show their aging and subtly. And I thought it was so nice that James never had sort of 5 years later, or 10 years later, that you feel that the characters are aging without it having to be sort of that obvious. So it was it's a combination of both. And then with Jane, it was very much it was finding her development as a woman. She's changing, and she has this very strong sexual identity. She falls in love with another man and is in a situation where she's deeply in love with two men, but for very different reasons. So there was a lot of emotional depth to mine in playing her.
No, when you were talking about going to the clinic, did you go to the clinic too?
Absolutely. I actually, there was a remark, we were so lucky, we met these amazing people who were so giving to us, and there was a woman and her husband. She has 3 daughters, Davina and her husband Eric, and I spent a lot of time with her, just sort of observing her day to day, what's involved for a couple in that situation and their family, and just it's without having that openness, it would be really hard. She totally let me into her life, because obviously she was going through it right at that moment, whereas Jane's experience was in many ways retrospective.
Yeah. And then also you talked about the first day. I mean, how much territory you were covering the first day. Were you nervous, excited?
James wrote me an email recently saying how we were on the sort of the knife edge of failure every day, and I've really got to say, for every single, and it didn't stop. There was no moment when it felt comfortable. The last scene of the film that we shot was the scene when they are in the when they've moved the bed down to the kitchen, and Stephen thanks Jane. And that scene originally, that had all changed, because in the script it had Stephen climbing up the stairs, climbing himself up the stairs, and then the next scene was in the bedroom a few months later up the stairs, and we just sort of established that he couldn't climb upstairs anymore. So James did what happens in MND households or ALS households, is that the house has to fit the circumstance. You have to stay ahead of the disease. And so this scene was just the two of them sitting in bed. It was meant to be, and I remember to the last scene we were having to improvise and come up with material, and it was the most incredible creative experience. But it was a failure. I mean, the whole way through it, until even in Toronto, like failure was sort of, and until Stephen and Jane and the founders.
Exactly. We showed the film to Stephen and Jane, and when we showed the film to Stephen, he came to working title production office, and you know the issue you have there is that once the film was over, it takes him quite a long time to give a reaction to it. So you show this very significant person in the life of the film, and you wait, and then you wait, and then you wait, and you have to fill this void. We all had this experience with Stephen where you just kind of have to talk, even though and fill it with just inane babble whilst you wait for his pronouncement. And thankfully and very graciously, he did indeed give us quite a good reaction, and subsequent to that has been even more, I think, enthusiastic about the film and what Eddie achieved in character and Felicity too. So both Jane and Stephen are now, I think, very comfortable with the film, and Jane in particular has seen it now a couple of times and got over that initial shock, I think, that anyone has seeing their life put on screen, and understands, I think, that there's a certain truth to the film that she recognises, and Stephen too, which I think is the best endorsement we could ever hope for or expect.
Yeah. I think we're going to take some questions from the audience, but before we do that, do you have anything to add to this? I mean, again, congratulations on the film. But
me? Oh God, no. Let's take some questions.
All right. Yes.
So this isn't really a question. I just wanted to congratulate the three of you. I think you've created here a movie that will live on with Schindler's List, and Gone with the Wind is one of the great classics of our time.
Did everybody hear that?
Feel free to say it again if you want.
Can we put that on the poster?
We'll repeat it several times in the next few minutes. Yes.
Steve and Jane, when they were there and offering assistance or watching, is there any major changes or anything they objected to during the film?
He asked if Stephen Hawking and Jane had objected to anything that they saw during filming.
There was one thing, when I met Stephen, which, as Felicity was saying, was a few days before we started filming. It takes him, as James was saying, a long time to speak now. That he just uses this muscle beneath his eye, which is, there's a sensor on his glasses and then a screen with the alphabet and a cursor going across the alphabet. And when he moves that muscle, it stops on one letter. So it takes him maybe 6 or 7 minutes to form a sentence. So, or even longer actually. In the time I spent with him, a few hours I spent with him, he maybe said 8 sentences. So he was. One of the things he asked me in that time was, "Are you playing me before the voice machine?" And I said yes. And he said my voice was very slurred. And there is one piece of footage of Stephen talking before the tracheotomy, and in that he's completely incomprehensible. And it was difficult for me because all of the stuff that we'd done beforehand, tracking the breakdown of his illness, was an educated guess, was to do with looking at photographs, showing them to specialists. But suddenly when you have the first bit of footage, that's the bit that you feel like you can actually use as a physical sort of replica in some ways, and a vocal replica. The problem was it's so incomprehensible, only Jane would understand him and his students. If you wanted to be one of Stephen's students, you'd go and spend 2 weeks with him learning to be able to understand him. But the problem with our film was that the producers were wary of having subtitles. And I totally understand that. But when Stephen said to me, when I'd said this to him, I was like, I don't know if we're going to be able to go to that full extreme because of subtitles. And he goes, well, couldn't you have someone translate me? And that was wonderful because then James and I, that being the specific note that Stephen had given, we took that information back to Anthony, the writer, who then wove those scenes in which Felicity translates sort of half what I'm saying, which is what happened. And so that was one example of something very specific that he added.
And then for Jane, it was very important, and she made it very clear for us, was trying to show the truth of care. because it's not a subject you find in cinema very often, and it's not always the most glamorous story to tell. And it was important that we tried to show that as truthfully as possible. The kind of the complications of that, and that's very important. But also on the first, when Jane came to visit set, one of the things she felt very strongly about was Eddie's hair as Stephen. So there was a moment when we were shooting, and then Jane ran up to Eddie and just went, "No, his hair wasn't like that. It wasn't like that at all." Restyled his hair. So she was very particular about that as well.
Sounds just like that too.
But did she worry about her own hair?
Well, it's very much, I remember I had all the pictures that had been taken of her in my trailer stuck on the wall, from her going from, when do we start, the 60s through to the present day. And she did have some very extreme haircuts that I was keen to put into the film. Trying to follow her as truthfully as possible.
Yes.
Well, given the intensity and the range of the movie is wonderful, by the way, I'd be interested if each of you could comment on anything you learned about yourselves doing the movie and or your view of life.
Did everybody hear the question? Wondering what they learned about themselves and about life while doing the film.
James.
Well, I think for all of us it was it's a privilege to make the film, and it's quite humbling, really, to represent these lives that you find so exemplary. I think whatever our difficulties were when we were filming, we all had that sense every morning that we could get out of bed and walk to the set, if you like. A very simple thing, but became something you didn't take for granted anymore, I guess. It's the physicality that we all have. That was one thing that was very specific. And in terms of a life lesson, I think these are exemplary lives, and there is something very admirable about the courage of these two people. And I think to say a cliche, but it's true that love is a very important force in the world. And without, I think, the love in that marriage, Stephen's scientific career may not have been quite so exalted. So that's, maybe it sounds a bit of a trite thing to say, but that was something that I really took away from this.
No, that's all.
I think the big thing that I took away was that it's such a specific story, this, about this family and these obstacles that were put in their way, and how they refused to be defined by those obstacles, but rather by how they chose to overcome them. And I took that from this film in perhaps in a metaphorical way, that we all have limitations put on us by other people or by fate or by circumstance, but how you choose to sort of react to those, overcome them, is really what defines us. So that was sort of what I took away.
I mean, in both as James and Eddie have said, I think that's what it is, something beyond ego in a way. That's what I sort of took away from it. That thing of you can't do anything on your own, that you need support, and absolutely, I think just a laugh, and that's how we get through things.
Also, the process of making the film was a very harmonious collaboration. That felt like a very useful thing to take forward in the work that we do as filmmakers and actors. The idea that we really did not have an ego when we were making this film. It was all about making the work as best it could be every single day. And we had to be that way, but that was something, again, that I really learned as a director and a filmmaker, that the collaboration in this film was a very beautiful thing, actually. When everyone was working towards one objective, and that objective was quite a noble one, to be true to this story. And that was something that I will take forward into my next piece of work, I'm sure.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Yes.
Yes, first, as a programmer from Kansas City, I wanted to add to the others that thank you for creating a film that speaks to the hearts and minds of audiences all over the world. We can see it. That so many of the audiences that are looking for beautiful films like this. But secondly, after seeing this film, and as I look back, my favorite scene was near the beginning where Hawkins is in the rowboat and he is the counter, the cheerleader for the team. And I think that it is so symbolic of what his example has been for the rest of us, his life. And I just wondered, when you did that scene, did you have anything like that in mind?
Well, no, but I'm very, I'm very glad that you extracted such a good and profound thing from it. It was one of those kind of scenes are very practical. You're on water. You don't need control as much as you want to control. Eddie's hat came off early on, and we embraced that. If you remember, and that just happened. We thought, we'll keep that, keep the hat there. But of course, it was all about showing this physicality, if you like, of a young man. That was another superficial thing about that scene. That's where I was at on that one, was that superficial. Oh, he's a cox in a boat, and he's using his voice and using his body, and there's a sort of camaraderie amongst able-bodied men. But thank you for developing the insight of that into something much better.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I work in an ALS clinic, and
Speak up.
I work with a lot of patients, and I can't tell you how excited all of the doctors, nurses, and patients have been about this movie coming out and representing motor neuron diseases to the public who often have very little understanding. So I'm very excited to be here, and I'm excited to go back to our people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to repeat, if you couldn't hear it, she said she works at an ALS clinic, and the people there are very excited about this film. She's going to be happy to go back and report on this. But yeah.
Can I just jump into that as well? I mean, the ALS community, and it is the ALSA here and the MNDA in London have been so supportive from the second that we started making this film, helping educate us and work with us to try and be as authentic as possible. But the most dumbfounding thing I found about going to this clinic for those 4 months was that there is very little that doctors can do, and they are just basically, that is the brutal truth. It is, 2 to 5 to 10 years, and it is about managing that time. And the people that we met, people like yourself who have been working in that community, have become friends and are extraordinary people. And I feel like it's a disease that I know the Ice Bucket Challenge helped raise. I felt like it helped raise the understanding of what the word or the knowledge of the word ALS. But I still feel like there needs to be an education to the world about what the actual brutality of the disease is, because it's been around for over 100 years and they're still struggling to get closer to finding a cure. So anyway, thank you. That means a lot.
Listen, I would like to stay here for another hour, but apparently they need this theater. So we can't.
Just settling in.
Maybe if we'll lock arms, we can just stay here and blockade the next screening. But seriously, thank you. I'm sorry we're out of time, but thank you all.